International law regulates the use of force through the United Nations Charter, particularly on Article 2(4), which generally prohibits the use of force between states. However, the rise of drone attacks and cross-border violence by non-state armed groups has challenged traditional interpretations of international law. In this scenario, a non-state armed group operating from State B launches a drone attack on State A, causing damage to a military base and several casualties. State A argues that it may use force within State B's territory because State B failed to prevent the attacks. On the other hand, State B claims that such actions would violate its sovereignty since it was not directly responsible for the attacks. This raises the questions of whether self-defense can be exercised against non-state actors under Article 51. There are two main approaches to this issue. First, Framework A, the strict sovereignty approach, argues that self-defense under Article 51 is only allowed when an armed attack is attributable to states. Supporters of this view believe that extending self-defense to attacks by non-state actors could undermine state sovereignty and territorial integrity. This approach is also generally supported by the International Court of Justice, which emphasizes the requirement of state attributions. In contrast, Framework B allows states to exercise self-defense against non-state actors when the territorial state is unable or unwilling to prevent attacks. Under this approach, Article 51 is triggered by an armed attack regardless of whether it is carried out by a state or non-state actors. It recognizes two legal relationships between the defending state and the non-state actors and between the defending state and the territorial state. Therefore, Framework B provides greater flexibility in responding to the modern security threats.
Good morning everyone, my name is Nusra Bazila binti Muhammad Jalaluddin and my matrix number is 304127. So today I'm going to talk about analysis of Framework A and Framework B. So the analysis will be done based on legal basis, strength and weakness. So first, Framework A is based on traditional interpretation of the United Nations Charter. According to Article 2(4), states are prohibited from using force against another state's territorial integrity or political independence. So there are only two exceptions, which is when the UNSC authorizes force under Chapter 7. Second, when a state exercises self-defense under Article 51 after an armed attack occurs. So this framework strongly emphasizes the principle of attribution. In other words, the state B can only be held legally responsible if it directly controls, commands, or substantially supports the armed groups. So this interpretation has also been supported by the several International Court of Justice decisions. So next is the strength of the Framework A. So the first, it protects the sovereignty and prevents stronger countries from interfering with weaker countries. Second, it reduces the possibility of abusing Article 51 because states cannot simply claim self-defense without sufficient evidence. Third, it promotes legal certainty and predictability because it closely follows the UN Charter and establishes the international law. So overall, this framework helps preserve international stability and the rule-based international order. So, however, there is also weakness for this Framework A. It was created at a time when states were the main actors in warfare, but today many threats come from non-state actors. So groups such as Al-Qaeda or ISIS have shown that they can launch serious attacks without direct support. So this without states' direct support. So this approach will create a safe havens for the armed groups operating in weak or failed states. In addition, victim states may remain vulnerable because they must wait until there is sufficient evidence linking to the attacks for another state. That's all from me.
This framework B emerged after the September 11 terrorist attack. This attack demonstrates that non-state actors can pose threats similar to those of state. The UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1368 and 1373, which recognize the right to self-defense against terrorism. This framework introduced the unable or unwilling doctrine. Under this principle, if State B is unable or unwilling to stop armed group from operating within its territory, State A may use proportionate force to defend itself. Several countries, including the United States, France, Turkey, and the United Kingdom, have applied this doctrine. Next, we go to strength. The main advantage of this framework is that it adapts to modern security challenges. It allows states to respond quickly to threats from terrorist organizations and cross-border attacks. It also encourages states to maintain control over their own territory. Furthermore, it allows immediate action when diplomatic negotiation or UN Security Council approval may take too long. Therefore, this approach is considered more practical in emergency situations. Next is weakness. Despite its advantages, this framework remains controversial. Its biggest weakness is that it is not explicitly stated in the UN Charter and has not been formally accepted by the ICJ. There is also a risk of abuse because powerful countries may use this doctrine to justify military intervention for political or strategic purposes. Finally, excessive reliance on unilateral action may weaken the UN collective security system and undermine international stability.
Hi everyone, my name is Nur Sakina and today I will present about the evaluation criteria matrix which comprise two competing legal frameworks regarding use of force against the non-state actors operating within another state territory. The purpose of this evaluation is to determine whether state A can legally use force within state B territory and to identify which frameworks provide the stronger and more defensible legal position under the international law. Now let's begin with legal consistency and state practice. First, for legal consistency, framework A follows the traditional interpretation of international law under Article 2/4 of the United Nations. It emphasizes that state sovereignty and territorial integrity means that self-defense is only permitted when an armed attack can be attributed to another state. In contrast, framework B is based on Article 51 of the United Nations and recognizes the right of self-defense against the non-state actors. Under the unable and unwilling doctrine, State A may use force within State B's territory if State B is unable or unwilling to prevent further attacks by the armed group. Therefore, the framework B is considered stronger because it better reflects the evolving interpretation of international law and responds more effectively to modern security threats such as terrorism and armed military. Moving on to state practice, framework A reflects the traditional position adopted by the International Court of Justice and prioritizes sovereignty and non-intervention. However, framework B has gained increasing support since the September 11 attacks. Several states has relied on the Article 51 to justify the military operation against the non-state actors operating in foreign territories. As a result, framework B is stronger in terms of state practice because it reflects contemporary international practice and demonstrates growing acceptance among the states. For this slide, I will discuss further of enforceability and justice of fairness. For enforceability, framework A may be difficult to apply in modern context because it requires attribution of the attack of the state. This requirement can delay defensive action and reduce the ability of state to respond quickly to transnational threats. By contrast, framework B allows states to take prompt action against non-state actors when the territorial state is unable or unwilling to act. It is therefore more practical and adaptable to modern warfare, including terrorism, drone attacks, and cross-border armed groups. Consequently, framework B is stronger because it provides a more effective mechanism for protecting national security. Finally, regarding to justice of fairness, framework A protects sovereignty and helps prevent unlawful intervention by more powerful states. On the other hand, framework B prioritizes the protection of victim states and their population from continuing armed attack. At the same time, it remains subject to the principle of necessity and proportionality, which acts as important safeguard against the abuse. Therefore, framework B is considered slightly stronger because it achieves a better balance between sovereignty and the right of self-defense.
For this comparative evaluation, Framework B demonstrates stronger overall performance compared to Framework A in responding to attacks by non-state actors. Firstly, Framework B adapts better to modern security threats because current conflict increasingly involve terrorist organization, militias, and armed groups instead of traditional state-to-state warfare. Under this framework, state may respond when the territorial state is unable or unwilling to prevent further attacks, making it more flexible in addressing cross-border violence and drone attacks. Secondly, Framework B reflects current international practice. Since the September 11 attacks, several states have increasingly relied on Article 51 to justify self-defense against non-state actors. This shows how international law continues to evolve to address contemporary security challenges. However, Framework B does not permit unlimited use of force. States must still follow legal principles including necessity, proportionality, and immediacy to ensure that military actions remain lawful. At the same time, Framework A still plays an important role because it protects state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-intervention. However, its strict approach may be less effective in dealing with modern transnational threats. Overall, Framework B provides a more practical, adaptable, and legally defensible approach under contemporary international law.
My name is Atina Debbie Mansur. My metric number is 304645, and I will present our final position on this scenario based on our analysis for both frameworks. We have selected Framework B, which supports the right of self-defense against non-state actors. Our main legal basis is Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. It states that countries have an inherent right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs. Crucially, Article 51 does not specifically say that attacks must only come from sovereign states. Therefore, it leaves room for self-defense against non-state actors. Let's look at our specific scenario. A non-state armed group operating inside State B launched drone attacks against State A. This attack caused serious damage to a military base and injured several people. Under international law, this clearly qualifies as an armed attack. When this happens, we apply the unable or unwilling doctrine. State A can legally use force inside State B's territory if State B cannot or will not stop the threat. By unable, it means State B might have a weak government or lacks control over its border to stop the group. And by unwilling, State B might be openly protecting the group or simply refusing to take action. Because of this, State A has the right to step in and defend itself. Moving on to the next slide, even though Framework B allows self-defense, State A must strictly follow 4 core international law requirements, which are armed attack, necessity, proportionality, and immediacy. The first one is armed attack. Not every small border scuffle counts. Based on the famous Nicaragua case, an attack must be grave and serious. In our scenario, a coordinated drone strike hitting a military base and causing multiple injuries definitely meets this high threshold. Second one is necessity. This means force must be the absolute last resort. State A has no other choice here because diplomatic efforts have completely failed and the drone threats are still actively continuing. The third one is proportionality, which means the defensive force must match the size of the threat. State A cannot launch an all-out war or destroy entire cities. It must target only the non-state actors and avoid unnecessary civilian harm. And the last one is immediacy. The reaction must happen quickly after the attack so it looks like defense, not late revenge. However, a short delay is legally allowed if State A needs time to gather evidence and plan its strategy. Since the attacks are ongoing, State A's response meets this requirement. Finally, let's look at why we rejected Framework A because of several limitations and weaknesses. For instance, Framework A relies on an old, strict view of sovereignty that only recognizes attacks from sovereign states. This approach has dangerous limitations in modern times. As we saw in historic events like the September 11 attacks, modern security threats usually come from terrorist groups and non-state actors using drones or bombs, not official state armies. If we strictly follow Framework A, State A's hands would be tied. It would be forbidden from entering State B to stop the attackers because doing so violates State B's sovereignty. This creates a dangerous safe haven problem, where armed groups can freely launch attacks from behind a border, knowing they are protected by law. In conclusion, Framework B is far more practical and realistic. While it still respects law and order through strict requirements like necessity and proportionality, it adapts to modern security realities and stops states from being used as safe havens from terrorism. That's all from me.
To conclude, Framework A and Framework B offers different interpretations of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Framework A only allows self-defense against attacks attributable to a state, while Framework B allows self-defense against non-state actors where the state is unable or unwilling to prevent attacks. In this scenario, the drone attacks by an armed group in State B damaged a military base and has caused injuries. Therefore, it may be considered an armed attack, allowing State A to exercise its right of self-defense. However, State A must still comply with the principle of armed attack, necessity, proportionality, and immediacy to ensure its actions are lawful. Overall, Framework B is the preferred approach because it better addresses modern security threats while balancing state sovereignty and national security. Our final position is that Framework B is the preferred approach, although Framework A provides stronger protections for state sovereignty. It is less practical in addressing modern security threats. Today, many attacks are carried out by terrorist organizations and other armed groups rather than states. Therefore, Framework B better reflect current international security realities. Framework B allows states to respond effectively to attacks by non-state actors while still respecting international law. It also strikes a balance between protecting state sovereignty and ensuring that states can defend themselves from ongoing attacks by armed groups. For this reason, we conclude that Framework B offers the most effective and practical interpretations of Article 51 in the modern security environment. Thank you.